Foundations of Western Political Thought. Module 3, Power Without Illusions, Machiavelli and Hobbes. Let us begin with the act of intellectual honesty that most people find uncomfortable. Politics is about power. It is about who rules, how they get to rule, how they keep ruling, and what happens to those who try to stop them. Everything else, the grand rhetoric about justice, the appeals to God or the people, the promises of liberty and prosperity, is either decoration or delusion. Sometimes useful decoration, sometimes necessary delusion, but decoration and delusion nonetheless. Is not a popular view. We prefer to believe that politics is about ideas, about values, about the common good, and perhaps it should be. But the thinkers we examine today, Niccolò Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes, were not interested in how politics should be in some ideal world. They were interested in how it actually is in this world, among actual human beings, with their actual appetites and fears. They looked at politics with a cold eye, and they told the truth as they saw it. For this, they have been reviled for centuries. They have also been read quietly by everyone who actually wields power. Our subjects are the two great realists. First, Machiavelli, the Florentine, who stripped away pious pretense and asked how power actually works, the fox and the lion, virtue against fortune, the dirty hands that politics requires, then Hobbes, who lived through civil war and drew the starkest conclusions. The state of nature as war of all against all, the sovereign as mortal God, the logic that drives from radical individualism to absolute obedience. Neither will make you comfortable. Both will force you to answer questions you would rather avoid. The Florentine context. Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469. To understand him, you must understand what Florence was and what Italy was. Italy, in the late 15th century, was not a nation. It was a patchwork of city-states, papal territories, and foreign-dominated regions, constantly at war with one another and constantly manipulated by the great powers of France and Spain. Florence itself lurched between republican government and domination by the Medici family. Milan, Venice, Naples, the Papal States, each pursued its own interests, made and broke alliances, hired mercenary armies, and intrigued endlessly against the others. This was not a world of a stable constitutional government. This was a world where a city could be free on Monday and under a tyrant by Friday, where a successful ruler might be poisoned by his own family, where mercenary captains sold their services to the highest bidder and sometimes decided to take payment in territory rather than gold. Machiavelli was not a philosopher observing from a comfortable distance. He was a diplomat and civil servant of Florentine Republic, conducting negotiations, organizing militias, watching at close range how power actually operated. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, he was arrested, tortured, and exiled to his farm. The prince, his most famous work, was written in enforced retirement by a man who knew what it was to be on the losing side. The Prince. The Prince, written around 1513 and published posthumously in 1532, is a short book. You can read it in an afternoon. Its effects have lasted 5 centuries. The book purports to be advice for a new ruler. Specifically, Machiavelli hoped for the Medici who might restore him to favor. How should a prince acquire a state? How should he keep it? What virtues should he cultivate? And what vices might he need to employ? The scandal of The Prince is not that it offers advice on these questions. Advice books for rulers were common. The scandal is the nature of the advice. Traditional mirrors for princes The genre was called exactly that. Urged rulers to be virtuous, be just, be merciful, be pious, keep your promises. God will reward you. Your subjects will love you, and your reign will prosper. Machiavelli surveys these recommendations and observes with devastating simplicity that they do not describe how successful rulers actually behave. Many princes who were just and merciful and pious ended up dead or exiled. Many who were cruel and treacherous and impious died in their beds surrounded by grandchildren. This might be lamentable. It might offend our moral sensibilities. But if we are giving practical advice to someone who actually wants to hold power, we must deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it were. The break with classical virtue. Here is the key passage from chapter 15 of The Prince. Machiavelli is discussing whether a prince should cultivate the traditional virtues. Many have imagined republics and principalities which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. Read that carefully. Machiavelli is not saying that virtue is bad or that vice is good. He is saying that the gap between moral ideals and political reality is so vast that a ruler who tries to act according to the ideals will be destroyed. The virtuous prince will keep his promises and be outmaneuvered by those who break theirs. He will be merciful and be overthrown by those who mistake mercy for weakness. He will tell the truth and be defeated by those skilled in deception. Therefore, Machiavelli concludes, a prince must learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not use it according to necessity. This is not a celebration of wickedness. It is a diagnosis of the conditions under which political power operates. The world contains people who do not play by the rules of conventional morality. If you insist on playing by those rules, regardless, you will lose to those who don't. The only question is whether you want to survive or whether you want to be virtuous. Often you cannot have both. The Fox and the Lion. Machiavelli develops this insight with an image that has become famous. A prince, he says in chapter 18, must know how to act like a beast as well as a man. And among beasts, he must be both fox and lion. The lion is strong but cannot recognize traps. The fox recognizes traps but cannot fight off wolves. Therefore, you must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten the wolves. Those who rely only on the lion do not understand statecraft force alone is not enough. You must also be cunning, deceptive, able to manipulate appearances. You must know when to keep your word and when to break it, when to be generous and when to be cruel, when to appear merciful and when to make an example that terrifies. Notice what Machiavelli is doing here. He's not saying that princes are beasts. He is saying that successful princes must be able to act like beasts when circumstances require. The key word is must. This is not permission. It is necessity. The world is what it is. Notice too the emphasis on appearances. A prince need not actually possess the virtues. Indeed, possessing them rigidly may be dangerous. What he must be able to do is appear to possess them while being ready to act otherwise when needed. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are, and those few dare not oppose themselves to the opinion of the many. This is politics as theatre, as performance, as the management of perceptions. It is uncomfortable to read. It is also, I submit, recognizable to anyone who has observed politics closely. Fortune and virtue. Machiavelli introduces two concepts that recur throughout his work: fortuna and virtue. Fortuna is fortune, chance, the unpredictable element in human affairs. However skilled you are, however well you plan, events can overwhelm you. The king dies unexpectedly, the harvest fails, a foreign power intervenes, you can do everything right and still lose, because circumstances turned against you. Machiavelli estimates in chapter 25 of The Prince that fortune controls about half of human affairs. The other half is within our power. Virtue is the quality that allows us to master that half. It is not virtue in the Christian sense, not humility, charity, meekness. It is closer to the Latin root, virtus, manliness, strength, skill. It is the ability to act decisively, to seize opportunities, to adapt to circumstances, to impose your will on events. The prince, with virtue, sees what fortune offers and acts. He does not hesitate, does not defer to convention, does not wait for permission when the moment comes. He takes it. Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli admired, despite his ultimate failure, had virtue. So he saw what needed to be done and did it, without sentiment, without hesitation. To be a fortune, Machiavelli says in a notorious passage, is like a woman. She favors the young and the bold, those who take her by force, rather than those who proceed cautiously. He was wrong about women, but not about fortune. The underlying claim is serious. In a chaotic world, aggression and speed often succeed where caution fails. The discourse is an republican virtue. The Prince is not Machiavelli's only work, and focusing on it alone distorts his thought. Say, the discourses on Livy, written around the same time, but published later, is a much longer work, a commentary on the first 10 books of Livy's History of Rome, where the prince advises a single ruler on how to acquire and hold power. The discourses examines republican government, how free states arise, how they maintain their freedom, how they decline and fall. Machiavelli's sympathies, it becomes clear, lie with republics. He admires the Roman Republic. Its institutions, its citizen militias, its capacity for self-renewal. He thinks republics are more stable than principalities, more adaptable, better at harnessing the talents of their citizens. And this is crucial. Republican government requires a particular kind of citizen. It requires people willing to fight for their city, to put public good above private interest, to accept the discipline of law. When citizens become corrupt, when they care only for private advantage, when they're unwilling to sacrifice for the common good, republics decay. They become prey for tyrants or foreign conquerors. This is civic republicanism, and it has a long afterlife in Western political thought, to be the idea that freedom requires virtue, that self-government requires self-discipline, that citizens have duties as well as rights. These ideas run through the English Commonwealth, the American founding, and beyond. But even in the discourses, Machiavelli remains Machiavelli. Republics, too, must sometimes act against conventional. They, too, must be willing to use force and fraud against enemy. They, too, must manage religion as a political tool. Whatever its truth or falsehood, the cold eye never warms religion as instrument. This brings us to one of Machiavelli's most unsettling themes, his treatment of religion. In the discourses, Machiavelli praises the religion of ancient Rome. not because it was true. That question does not interest him, but because it was useful. Roman religion encouraged martial virtue, taught citizens to subordinate private interest to public good, sanctified oaths and treaties, and provided rituals that bound the community together. Compare this, he suggests, to Christianity. Christian virtues, humility, meekness, contempt for worldly things, turning the other cheek, are not conducive to political vigor. A religion that teaches men to endure suffering rather than resist it, that directs their hopes toward heaven rather than earthly glory, that celebrates martyrs rather than conquerors. Such a religion produces subjects, not citizens. Machiavelli is not quite saying Christianity is false, saying something more troubling, that its truth or falsehood is less important politically than its effects on character and behavior. A useful lie may serve the state better than a debilitating truth. That sentence alone should make you shiver. Instrumental view of religion scandalized Christian readers and continues to disturb. It treats what believers consider the most important questions, the existence of God, the fate of the soul, the path to salvation, as secondary to questions of political utility. Suggests that rulers should manage religion the way they manage any other political resource, promoting what strengthens the state and suppressing what weakens it. Whether Machiavelli himself believed in any religion is unclear. What is clear is that he refused to let religious considerations override political judgment. If Christianity had made Italy weak and divided, and he thought it had, then so much the worse for Christianity. The question of dirty hands, Machiavelli forces us to confront what philosophers call the problem of dirty hands. Can political action be morally pure, or does the very nature of politics require actions that would be wrong for private individuals? Consider a ruler facing a genuine threat, a conspiracy, an invasion, an insurrection. To defeat the threat, he must act quickly, perhaps brutally. He must dissemble, perhaps torture, perhaps kill people who might be innocent. If he acts with perfect moral scrupulousness, he may lose, and his state, his citizens may suffer the consequences. What should he do? Machiavelli's answer is clear. He should do what is necessary to preserve the state, even if it means doing things that would be wicked for a private person. A political responsibility is different from private morality. The ruler who lets his state be destroyed because he refused to dirty his hands has failed in his fundamental duty. But notice, and this is important, Machiavelli does not say the ruler should enjoy the dirty work. He does not celebrate cruelty for its own sake. Cruelty should be used well, he says. In The Prince applied once decisively for necessity and not prolonged for pleasure. A prince should not be gratuitously cruel, but he must be willing to be cruel when circumstances require. This is not moral nihilism. It is a recognition that political leaders face choices that private individuals do not. Choices where all options involve some evil, where the question is not whether to do wrong, but which wrong to do. Many political thinkers since have tried to escape this dilemma. They have argued that moral rules must be absolute, that good ends never justify evil means, that a ruler should keep his hands clean even if it cost him his state. Machiavelli would reply, such people have never held responsibility for the safety of others. They have the luxury of purity because someone else does the dirty work. Scandal and the truth. Machiavelli was scandalous because he said openly what many people do but few admit. He stripped away the pious language that disguises political action and showed the operations of power beneath. This made him useful to those who wanted to understand power. It also made him a convenient villain for those who preferred to maintain illusion. Machiavellian became a term of abuse, meaning cynical, amoral, manipulative, as if politicians before Machiavelli had been choir boys, humming hymns while sharpening their daggers. The honest response to Machiavelli is not to pretend he is wrong, but to ask, given that this is how power often works, what follows? Do we resign ourselves to cynicism? Do we try to change the conditions that make such behavior necessary? Do we accept that politics and morality operate by different rules? Machiavelli does not answer these questions for us. He forces us to ask them. Hobbes and the English Catastrophe. We turn now to Thomas Hobbes, born in England in 1588 the year. He liked to note when the Spanish Armada threatened invasion. Fear and I were born twins. He reportedly said, whether or not the story is literally true, it captures something essential about his thought. Hobbes lived through the English Civil War, a conflict that killed a higher proportion of the population of the British Isles than the First World War. He saw the established order collapse into chaos, saw king and parliament take up arms against each other, saw religious factions tear the country apart, saw a king tried and beheaded by his own subjects. This was not abstract speculation. This was experience. When Hobbes writes about the state of nature as a war of all against all, he is not constructing a thought experiment. He is describing what he saw when political authority broke down. Hobbes fled to Paris in 1640, sensing which way the wind was blowing. He remained there for 11 years, tutoring future Charles II in mathematics, writing, thinking. Masterpiece. Leviathan was published in 1651, just 2 years after Charles I lost his head. The state of nature. Hobbes begins in Leviathan with a thought experiment that has become foundational to modern political philosophy. Imagine human beings without government, without law, without any common power to keep them in order. What would such a condition be like? His answer is famous. It would be a war of all against all. Not necessarily constant fighting, but a constant readiness to fight, a constant insecurity, a constant fear. Why? Because human beings are roughly equal in their ability to harm one another. The weakest can kill the strongest by stealth, by alliance, by weapons. No one is so powerful that they can afford to relax. Everyone must be on guard. And human beings want the same things. Food, shelter, security, honor, power. When two people want the same thing and cannot both have it, they become enemies. Competition breeds conflict. Conflict breeds preemptive attack. I strike you before you can strike me. You strike your neighbor before he can strike you. The logic spiral adds to this diffidence, the mutual distrust that arises when you cannot know another's intention. Even if I mean you no harm, how do you know that? How do I know you mean me no harm? In uncertainty, the rational strategy is to assume the worst and act accordingly. Add glory, the human desire for recognition, for status, for superiority. People fight not only for material goods, but for reputation, for pride, for the pleasure of being thought powerful from these three causes. Competition, diffidence, and glory. Hobbes derives the war of all against all. And in such a condition, he writes in chapter 13 of Leviathan, in one of the most quoted passages in political philosophy, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This is not a historical claim about how humans once lived. It is a logical claim about what happens when political authority is absent, and Hobbes thought the English Civil War had proved his point. The laws of nature, human beings in the state of nature, are miserable, but they're not stupid. They can reason, and reason tells them that this condition is intolerable and that there must be a way out. Hobbes calls the deliverances of reason on this subject. The laws of nature laid out in chapters 14 and 15 of Leviathan, they are not laws in the sense of commands backed by punishment. They are theorems, rational conclusions about what conduces to self-preservation. The fundamental law of nature is to seek peace. If it can be had, war is bad for everyone. Even the winners suffer. Rational self-interest points toward cooperation. But peace requires trust, and trust is precisely what the state of nature lacks. If I lay down my weapons and you keep yours, I am your victim. Therefore, the second law of nature is that we must lay down our rights together, simultaneously, by mutual agreement. We must covenant with one another. It is the social contract, not a historical event, but a logical necessity. If we want peace, we must agree to limit our natural freedom, our right to do whatever we judge necessary for survival, in exchange for the same limitation by others. But covenants without the sword, Hobbes says, are mere words. Promises mean nothing if there is no power to enforce them. We are back where we started, in a condition of mutual distrust, where no one dares disarm first. Sovereign. The solution is to create a power so overwhelming that it can enforce covenants, punish defectors, and keep everyone in awe. This is the sovereign, the Leviathan, that mortal god to which we owe our peace and security. The logic runs like this. We all agree to surrender our right of self-government to a single authority, whether one person or an assembly. We authorize the sovereign to act in our name. Sovereign's will becomes our will, because we have made it so by our consent. And the sovereign's power must be absolute, not tyrannical. Hobbes is not celebrating cruelty for its own sake, but undivided and unlimited. Why? Because any division of sovereignty recreates the condition of war. If there are two authorities with equal power, who settles disputes between them. Only force we are back in the state of nature. This is why Hobbes opposes the division of powers that would later become a cornerstone of liberal constitutionalism. For him, divided sovereignty is a contradiction in terms. Sovereignty means the final word. There can be only one final word. The sovereign makes law and cannot be bound by law, since there is no higher authority to bind him. Sovereign judges disputes and cannot be judged, since he is the source of judgment. The sovereign wages war and makes peace, controls religion, censors opinions dangerous to public order. This sounds terrifying. It was meant to. Hobbes wants us to understand what sovereignty actually requires. Most people, he thought, preferred comfortable illusions. The idea that you could have the benefits of political order without granting anyone the power to maintain it. The Civil War had shown where that led. The paradox of obedience. Here is the apparent paradox in Hobbes. He begins with radical individualism, the state of nature, where each person is judge of their own interests and has the right to do whatever they think necessary for survival. He ends with absolute sovereignty, the demand that we surrender our judgment to the Leviathan. How does extreme individualism lead to extreme authoritarianism? The answer is that Hobbes thinks unregulated individualism is self-defeating. The state of nature, where everyone pursues their own interests without limit, is a condition where no one's interests can be reliably secured. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. Precisely because there is no common path. Freedom in the state of nature is freedom to be killed. Security under the sovereign is constraint, yes. But it is constraint that makes industry, commerce, art, and comfortable living possible. The bars of the cage are also the walls that keep out the wolf. You surrender your natural freedom, not because the sovereign is wise or good, but because any order is better than chaos. A bad king is better than civil war. An unjust law is better than no law at all. This is not a ringing endorsement of tyranny. It is a cold calculation. Hobbes is not telling you to love the Leviathan. He is telling you that the alternative is worse. The limits of obligation. There are limits even for Hobbes. You cannot covenant to give up your right to self-preservation, because self-preservation is the whole point. If the sovereign commands you to kill yourself, you may refuse. If he sends soldiers to execute you, you may resist. Not because you have a right to revolution, Hobbes explicitly denies this, but because no contract can bind you to your own destruction. Similarly, if the sovereign fails to provide protection, if he cannot, in fact, keep the peace, your obligation and sovereignty and protection are reciprocal. You obey because the sovereign protects. If he cannot protect, the deal is off. This creates a strange logic. Successful usurper, once he establishes effective control, becomes the legitimate sovereign. The defeated king, once he cannot protect his subjects, loses their allegiance. A legitimacy follows power, not the other way around. Hobbes was suspected of writing this to justify submission to Cromwell's regime after the royalist defeat. Perhaps he was. But the logic is consistent with his premises. Politics is not about bloodlines or divine right. It is about effective power to maintain order. The materialist foundation underlying all of this is Hobbes's materialism. He believed that everything that exists is matter in motion, including human beings, including thought itself. There is no immaterial soul, no transcendent realm, no divine providence guiding history. This matters politically because it strips away the metaphysical foundations of traditional authority. Kings do not rule by divine right because there is no divine intervention in human affair. The church has no special authority because there is no supernatural revelation, or if there is, we have no reliable way to know its content. All we have is matter, motion, and human convention. Political authority is artificial, constructed by human agreement for human purposes. It can be analyzed, criticized, redesigned. This makes Hobbes a founder of modern political science. He wants to study politics the way Galileo studied falling bodies. By identifying the basic elements, the forces at work, the laws of motion, the result is mechanistic, unsentimental, and deliberately shocking to those who preferred to see politics through a theological lens. Religion and the causes of war. Hobbes was acutely aware that the English Civil War was, among other things, a religious conflict. Puritans against Anglicans, Presbyterians against independents, enthusiasts who claimed direct inspiration from God, against those who defended established church order. In Leviathan, he devotes enormous space, roughly half the book, to religious questions, not because he was a believer wrestling with theological problems, but because he knew that theology cared about power, whatever theologians claimed to care about. His analysis is ruthless. Claims to prophetic inspiration are unverifiable. How do I know that you received a message from God? Only because you say so. And what is to stop me from claiming my own revelation, contradicting yours? Nothing but the sword. Scripture itself cannot settle disputes, because Scripture must be interpreted, and who has authority to interpret? Catholics, said the Pope. A Protestants said each believer guided by the Holy Spirit. But believers guided by the Holy Spirit reached violently incompatible conclusions. Hobbes' solution is radical. The sovereign must control religion, not because the sovereign is theologically competent. Hobbes is deliciously agnostic about the truth of religious claims, but because allowing multiple religious authorities means allowing multiple sources of obligation that may conflict, and conflicting obligations means civil war. The sovereign decides what doctrines may be publicly taught, what forms of worship are permitted, what Scripture means for purposes of public order, private belief. Is another matter. The sovereign cannot control what people think. And Hobbes seems not to care. Public religion must be unified under sovereign control. This is Erastianism, the subordination of church to state, taken to its logical extreme. It offended Catholics who believed in papal supremacy. It offended Puritans who believed in their own supremacy. Both camps were certain they were right. Both were certain Hobbes was wicked. This did not trouble him. But consider the alternative. If the church is independent of the state, there are two authorities claiming obedience. When they conflict, citizens must choose, and their choice may lead them to rebellion. If individual conscience is supreme, every person becomes a law unto themselves, and we are back in the state of nature. Hobbes saw the wars of religion and concluded, this is what happens when people take their private opinions about invisible matters and act on them politically. The only solution is to take religion out of politics, or rather to bring religion firmly under political control. Whether Hobbes was right, Lasher, was Hobbes right about human nature, about the state of nature, about the necessity of absolute sovereignty? These questions have been debated for centuries, and we will not settle them here. But let me offer some observations. Psychology seems too narrow. He reduces human motivation to fear and self-interest with a nod to glory. But people also act from love, loyalty, principle, habit. They sacrifice themselves for causes, for people, for ideas. Hobbes's calculating egoist is a partial portrait at best. His state of nature may be a false dilemma between the war of all against all and absolute sovereignty. There might be intermediate possibilities, customary law, social norms, voluntary associations, distributed authority. Anthropologists have documented stateless societies that are not Hobbesian nightmares. That his absolute sovereign creates as many problems as it solves. What prevents the sovereign from becoming a worse threat than the state of nature? Hobbes says the sovereign has no incentive to abuse subjects, since his power depends on their prosperity. But history is full of sovereigns who did not grasp this point. And yet there is something in Hobbes that survives these criticisms, the insight that political order is artificial and fragile, the recognition that rights without enforcement are empty, the understanding that unlimited liberty can be self-defeating, the awareness that conflict is always possible when people disagree about fundamental values, and there is no authority to resolve the dispute. We may reject his conclusions while acknowledging the seriousness of his question. Legacy. Machiavelli and Hobbes are often grouped together as realists, thinkers who see politics as it is, rather than as moralists wish it were. This is fair as far as it goes. But there are differences. Machiavelli's world is plural, many states competing, no final arbiter, the constant possibility of war and revolution. Virtue matters because fortune is unpredictable. A skilled actor who can adapt to circumstances may triumph against the odds. Hobbes's world drives toward unity. The logic of his argument demands a single sovereign power within each state. Competition between sovereigns continues in the international realm, which remains a state of nature. But within the state, there must be one final authority. Machiavelli admires republics for their dynamism and citizen virtue. Hobbes prefers monarchy for its clarity and decision, though he allows that sovereignty could in principle reside in an assembly. Machiavelli is a Florentine patriot, writing in Italian, drawing on Roman history. Hobbes is a systematic philosopher, writing in English and Latin, constructing arguments from first principle. But both share the code I. Both refuse to let moral sentiment cloud their analysis of how power. Both understand the political order is fragile, artificial, always threatened by the chaos that underlies it. How to recognize these ideas today. When someone argues that we must be realistic about power, that idealism in foreign policy leads to disaster, that we should deal with the world as it is rather than as we wish it were, that is Machiavelli's legacy. When someone argues that state sovereignty must be absolute, that divided government leads to gridlock or civil conflict, that order must come before liberty, that is Hobbes's shadow. When someone justifies morally questionable actions on grounds of necessity, the ticking bomb, the emergency exception, the claim that rules must be broken to save the system, they are walking a path Machiavelli cleared. When someone argues that without a strong state we would descend into chaos, that human nature is too competitive and distrustful for anarchism to work, that the police and the army are all that stand between us and the war of all against all, they are channeling Hobbes. These ideas are not comfortable, but they are serious. They deserve answers, not dismissal. The liberal tradition that we will trace from Locke onwards can be understood as an attempt to answer Hobbes, to accept his diagnosis of the problem while rejecting his absolutist solution. Yes, we need political authority. Yes, order is valuable. But perhaps power can be limited, divided, checked, made accountable. Perhaps there are rights that no sovereign may violate. Perhaps consent must be ongoing, not a one-time surrender. Whether the liberals succeeded is a question for later lectures. But they were arguing with Hobbes They were taking his challenge seriously. And Machiavelli haunts every debate about political ethic. Every time someone argues that a dirty deed was necessary, the covert operation, the targeted killing, the deal with an unsavory ally, Machiavelli is present. Every time someone replies that principles must be absolute, that good ends never justify evil, means that we should keep our hands clean, whatever the cost, they are arguing against Machiavelli. Neither thinker tells us what we should do, but they force us to see what we are doing, to strip away the comfortable language that disguises political action, to confront the hard choices that power involves. That is their gift and their curse. Pause and consider. Before we move on, let me leave you with a question. Hobbes argues that any sovereign is better than the state of nature, that even a bad government is preferable to no government at all, because order makes life possible, while chaos makes life unbearable. Is this true? If Hobbes is right, then even Stalin was preferable to anarchy. The Khmer Rouge were better than the war of all against all. Every genocidal regime was at least keeping order. Still, feeling persuaded? Or does Hobbes' argument only work for moderately bad governments? The corrupt, the inefficient, the unjust, but not genocidal? Is there a point at which the sovereign becomes worse than the disease it was meant to cure? And if so, what follows? Do subjects have a right to resist, to revolt, to tyrannocide? Hobbes says no, but many later thinkers would disagree. We will meet them soon. That is enough for this lecture. Next, we turn to John Locke, who accepted much of Hobbes's framework, but reached very different conclusions about the limits of political power and the rights of those who live under it. End of Module 3.